So many people didn't enjoy history as a subject in school. I don't know if you did, but some teachers taught it as a very dry recitation of facts and dates to memorize for tests. And a lot of folks don't find that appealing for obvious reasons. The subject seemed boring oftentimes because it lacked the story of the human condition that was behind all of the events of history. And for you public school alumni, it also lacks something else, and that is how God was framing history for his glory and for his purposes. History is filled with wonderful accounts of God's providence. We just have to know it, and we have to see it from that perspective. A history, as we go through this, it also supports these supernatural claims of Scripture. For instance, even as we just look at it from an archaeological perspective, for a while in modern science and modern archaeology, there was doubt that the Bible was reliable because some people said there just isn't any evidence that there is such a thing as a Hittite. The Bible talks about the Hittites, but did it just make up this whole civilization? Well, today, not only have archaeologists confirmed the existence of such a people as the Hittites, there is now an entire field of study that has been crafted to study them known as Hittitology. And so, yes, the Bible was truthful in reporting these people. And as we continue to look at the various peoples and histories that it records, it is faithful. We can continue to see that it is being confirmed. Knowing history is important to be able to see that. And history also confirms the Bible's supernatural claims in another way. And I have an extended quote here from one study that explains it. Fulfilled prophecy is one of the proofs of the inspiration of the Bible. For only an omniscient God can know future events accurately and direct his servants to write them down. Quote, he reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him, Daniel 2:22. It is no surprise then that the radical critics have attacked the book of Daniel, and especially these chapters, because they claim that nobody could write in advance so many accurate details about so many people and events. Their scientific conclusion is that the book of Daniel is a fraud. It was written centuries after these events, and therefore is not a book of prophecy at all. And these critics can't deny the historicity of the events because the records are in the annals of ancient history for all to read and cannot be denied. Therefore, to maintain their scientific theories, they must deny the reality of prophecy. Those of us who believe in a great God have no problem accepting the word of prophecy, 2 Peter 1:19 through 21. We should be able to accept this word. And as we look at it and we see that the annals of history indeed confirm what we're reading here, we are seeing that God's word itself is being confirmed, and it can be trusted. It can be trusted. This chapter predicts the history preceding Antiochus Epiphanes with wonderful detail. Not only does that prove its divine origins, but it also that would serve as a great comfort to the Jews who would be suffering under the various conflicts that we read about during this era of history. And it also tells us something else. As we get into what we sometimes call the 400 silent years, the intertestamental period, the time in between the Old and New Testaments, God predicted what would be happening during that time. He protected his people, and that time was anything but silent. It was not silent. God was at work. And so as a result, again, people who were living at that time, God's people could have complete confidence that they would make it through their conflicts and that they would see their promised Messiah. And for the godly Jews who were taking his word seriously, you will note in the first century, they were expecting the Messiah. They were expecting the Messiah. That's in part because of what God is working here. Now, because this is a very specific chapter, I know that this is going to be difficult. Modern readers can find it very hard to navigate as they are reading each of these, especially if they are reading each of these verses without a firm grasp of ancient Near East history. And that is not something that is taught too much in schools. If it is taught very briefly as a subunit, and then you move on to something greater because that's not seen as a historical emphasis in most curricula around the country as you're studying world history. It is important to see that history, though. It is important to understand it. This chapter covers it begins, I should say, at the end of the Babylonian captivity, which is in the 6th century BC, with the conquering of Babylon by Cyrus. It covers the rise and then the waning of the Persian Empire, which Daniel is currently living in when he receives this prophecy. And it then covers the coming of Alexander the Great with the Greek Empire, the Grecian Empire, and what's known as the Hellenization of the area, as all of these peoples are being converted into being Greek-speaking peoples. This is all happening before a growing Roman Empire. The empire, of course, that will be in power by the time we get to the New Testament. So the Old Testament closes with Persian dominance. The New Testament opens with Roman dominance. In the middle of that is Greek dominance, first with Alexander the Great, and then with his generals. We'll talk about that here this evening. Now, this is difficult, as I said, and I know that that's a lot to consider. In fact, I came across one comment in a commentary that reads this way: this chapter might be treated in Bible classes. We do not see how it could be used for a sermon or sermons. Well, I'm going to try. I'm going to try. And other people have tried, and I think it is worth trying to use this for our sermons. So as I said, this begins with the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC. That's the 500s. For those of you who are looking up there at the screen, remember in the past chapter, Daniel was visited by Gabriel. He was also visited by Christophany, and with Gabriel touching him and telling him that he is about to reveal to him the future. This is that revelation. And so chapter 11 flows from chapter 10. And here we see that he is continuing that. Now, what happened in chapter 10? Well, we saw that not only that Gabriel was revealing it, but as we get into chapter 11, verse 1 here, this is leading into the very first year of Persian dominance in Babylon. Darius the Mede, or Cyrus, not only conquered conquered Babylon, he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And we see that in Ezra chapters 1 through 4. But what we also see there is that only about 42,000 of them returned. Of all the people who had been taken, only about 42,000 returned. The Jewish people still needed purification then. They still needed preparation for the coming Messiah in just 500 years. And that sounds like a long time. It's been 2,000 years since his first coming. Perhaps we need a lot of purification and preparation for his second coming, but they needed it, and it was almost time. It was almost the right time. They needed to be prepared. Well, that's what this chapter is covering, that preparation, that continued preparation. The Babylonian captivity was part of that preparation of purification. Now they are moving into the second step. They're back in the land, and they're getting ready for the Messiah. Verses 1 through 20 of chapter 11 cover the end of Persian dominance, as I said, the rise of Alexander the Great, the fracturing of his empire. There are 6 Syrian wars that take place in history, 5 of which are talked about in this chapter. And all of that is driven by control of the region, including Israel. What we're going to see as we keep reading about the king of the north coming against the king of the south, and the king of the south coming against the king of the north, we're going to be looking at Israel from an embattled standpoint. It is right in between these two warring nations, these two warring kingdoms, right in the middle of the King's Highway. And every time there's a conflict, guess where those armies pass? Right through Israel, right through Judea. And they are right in the middle of everything. God has a reason for that. So let's walk through this chapter carefully. As we're looking at this verse by verse, we're going to note how God has fulfilled his word and what God is telling his people to expect so that they will be confident that he is in control. Our focus this evening won't be those first 20 verses. As I said at the very beginning, I couldn't make it 20 verses. Sorry. Already this has been a long introduction. We haven't even really got into it yet. So we're only going to go the first 9 verses this morning. And as we do that, we're going to see God's sovereign hand over Persia in verses 1 and 2, over Greece in verses 3 through 4, and finally over the northern and southern kingdoms in verses 5 through 9. And so let's first begin with Persia, and we'll consider God's hand over Persia in verses 1 through 2. In the first year of Darius the Mede, and this again is Gabriel talking to Daniel, I arose to be an encouragement and protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Now, this first verse, again, it brings us right back to the previous chapter. And although a lot of translations place it as a chapter heading, as the first verse of chapter 11, it really seems to fit better as the last verse of chapter 10. Remember, the chapters and the verses, these numbers are not inspired. They're not part of the original text. We added them later to try to navigate the passages easier. And it looks like someone said, okay, so in the first year of Darius the Mede. That's how these chapters usually begin. So that seems like a good way to begin this chapter. No, that is Gabriel rewinding the clock by 2 years and saying, okay, now I'm going to tell you what happened 2 years ago. And so he is saying why he and Michael have this reciprocal protection thing going on and what they were doing and what they are in fact continuing to do. And so that is just continuing what the angels are doing. What are they doing? Well, again, as I said, this was a couple of years ago. Why do I say it was a couple of years ago? Because if you go back to chapter 10, in verse 1, before the angel comes, when is it? It's the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Chapter 11, verse 1, the 1st year of Darius the Mede. So instead of 3 years, it's now the 1st year. The 1st year, by the way, of Darius the Mede is the 1st year of Cyrus. And so this is talking about the same person. Gabriel is rewinding, and he is saying that he had supported and protected Michael. Why? Because the occasion likely involved Cyrus's decision to allow the Jews to return to Judea, to Jerusalem. Remember, at the end of the Babylonian captivity, the Persians might have just said, yeah, no, Jews, you stay here. We don't want you going back home. And yet God, again, prophecy being fulfilled, God in Isaiah called Cyrus by name and said, you will be my shepherd to lead my people back home. And so when someone showed Cyrus this prophecy, and it was probably Daniel, because who else would have been great for this task? Cyrus said, this is incredible. God predicted that I would overthrow Babylon 100 years before it happened, and he wants me to return his people? Okay. And he does. Now, he could have chosen not to believe the prophecy. He could have chosen to shrug it off if he had given in to demonic influence. Remember what we said about the prince of Persia. He was there trying to ensure that the Persians were doing what Satan wanted the Persians to do, because Persia became the most powerful empire in that day. But Gabriel and Michael go and they make sure that it actually does what God wants the empire to do. And guess what happens? The empire sends the children home, the children of Israel home. Now, this means that angels are fighting to ensure the good desires of the Lord and to make sure they come to pass. In other words, as one study notes here, the angel Gabriel lets Daniel know the good service he has done to the Jewish nation. Gabriel has supported the Jewish nation here. As another study explains, this suggests that though the kingdoms of the world are under demonic control, their human rulers can be delivered from that control and used for a higher purpose by God as he sees fits. And so this is what the angels are doing behind the scenes. That's why I say, by the way, because you might say, this sounds a lot like the last point that you were talking about with your previous message. Yes, this verse probably does work a little bit better with chapter 10, but that's okay. That's fine. We are just setting the stage here. Now, as we set the stage and we think about the Persians probably don't know, of course, that Satan, that his minions are trying to influence them and manipulate them for his purposes. But regardless of that, the Lord sends his angels to intervene and to make sure that his will is being fulfilled. So good angels can be entrusted with influence over national affairs to counteract evil and to help with the good. And so in verse 2, Gabriel says, okay, I'm going to tell you the truth about all this. Now, why does he say that? Is he saying that because he had been lying before? No, of course not. He is saying that because back in chapter 10, verse 21, he referenced the book of truth, the book of God's secret and deep decisions that he has not necessarily revealed to the rest of the world. We're not talking about the book of truth as in the Bible. We're talking about the book of truth as in God's decision for the nations. How the nations are going to go, when nations will rise and when they will fall. Gabriel's now going to reveal to Daniel the secret will of God for the nations in the intertestamental period. And he notes that there are three kings which will arise after Cyrus. Now, these three Persian kings have nothing to do with Christmas. So I don't know why you asked about that, but they don't have to do with Christmas. They are typically identified, though, as Cambyses, the Pseudo-Samaritus, and Darius the First. I would love to talk about these guys. You may ask me, well, who are they? I'd love to tell you. I don't have time. We're going to have to move on to the fourth of these, and he is the greatest king, the most important, and Gabriel reveals that he will be far richer, far more influential. This is Xerxes the First. Xerxes the First. And through a interesting trick of the Hebrew and the way people pronounce things, he was remembered in Esther as Ahasuerus, and he reigned there in 486 to 465 BC. He was wealthy. And because of his wealth, he could fund a massive invasion of Greece. And he decided to do just that. The Persians, remember, this is the Persian Empire. They're great, they're influential. And what do empires do? They want to expand. And so he launches an attack on Greece. This is the Xerxes, by the way, who faced King Leonidas at Thermopylae, which was depicted with a great deal of artistic license in 300, the book, the film. And no, he did not look like that. That is not what Xerxes looked like. That was, again, a great deal of license. Now, he had success, and he was famous for some victories. However, he did eventually lose. And when he lost, he was walloped. And he went back home whimpering. And as one study notes here, all of this occurred between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Esther. He came back home bitter and angry and sought to find relief for his wounded pride by enjoying his harem. It was at this time that Esther entered the picture. And so that was Xerxes. That was this fourth great king that was mentioned here. There were others. For instance, there's also Artaxerxes the first of Ezra and Nehemiah later on that is mentioned there, but not mentioned here. And that leads to an interesting question. Why not have everyone listed in this chapter? God could really just list out every single person and predict. Why doesn't he do that? Why doesn't he include all of surrounding history and say, okay, and in China, this is what's going on, and in South America, this is what's going on at this time? Because it didn't matter in regard to this prophecy. It's not germane to the people of God and to what God is doing at this time in this area. God is doing things in history all around the world. But at this point, he is doing something particular for his people here. And this is where he is choosing to work. And so he is focused on the history that affects his people. And so, for instance, Xerxes' failed campaign not only set up for the events of the book of Esther, but it also marked the beginning of Persia's decline. And that culminated in Alexander's conquest later on. And so this chapter is astonishing predictions. And we've just scratched the surface. We're just beginning here. There are 130 details in the first 35 verses, which are validated by history. 130 details in the first 35 verses that are validated by history. And that all displays God's omniscience, and God's sovereignty over history. The Bible records history all the way to Nehemiah's time. And then, of course, as I noted earlier, there are the 400 silent years. And then we get to the time of Christ. And yet, God also predicted history after and in between these two testaments. And it is all being fulfilled perfectly. And what is some of that history? Well, let's consider that next as we consider God's hand over Greece. Verses 3 through 4. And a mighty king will arise. So this is different than the king that we were just talking about. A mighty king will arise. This is after that. And he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. What are we talking about here? Well, the Greco-Persian, I'm jumping the gun here, the Greco-Persian Wars during this time caused a stir in Greece. As people like Xerxes are trying to invade, that does tend to worry people. And they unite under Philip the Macedonian. He becomes king of Greece. He becomes an influential king. And he has his son tutored by another famous person in history, Aristotle. So Aristotle tutors his son. That's something to be proud about, I suppose. You could say, well, I was tutored by Aristotle. And when Philip was assassinated, his son took over the throne at 16 years of age. He was just 16 years old when he became king. Well, who is this lad? Well, of course, this mighty king is someone we know well from history and from our study in Daniel, because we talked about him in Daniel chapter 8. That is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. Someone said that must be really hard to live up to that name, being called Alexander the Great, because you always have to do things great, not just good. Well, he got that name later on because of the great things he did. He's remembered as the Great because of his lightning fast conquering of the known world at that time. And Alexander the Great was the perfect candidate for the phraseology that's used here. He's described as a mighty king. And that could be also translated as a warrior king. As a warrior king. And he did not turn his back on the invasion of Greece. In the year 334 BC, he invaded the Persian Empire. So the Persians invaded Greece, and guess what Alexander the Great did? He invaded Persia. We can see why now. See, history's connected. These aren't just dates. These are people who have the same heart condition that we do. They get upset about things, and they say, okay, these people have to pay. And so, of course, the right man arises at the right time, and he says, I'm going to make them pay. Sometimes people are fooled that they are the right man, but in God's providence, sometimes it is the right person. And he invades Persia. Between the years 334 and 330, he conquered Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and the Medo-Persian Empire, and he extended his rule as far as India. So he conquered more territory than the Assyrians ever had, the Babylonians ever had, the Persians ever had, and he had the greatest empire of his day. In fact, that's why we see that the text says he does as he pleases. The text said that of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, had lots of great success. It says that of Antiochus IV. It says it also of the future Antichrist. The future Antichrist. And so this is a young man who does as he pleases. And as he's growing, he becomes, as one commentary describes him, an unstoppable power. No one else is saying, well, I'm going to stop Alexander. Nope. He is steamrolling all of the nations. Now, as he is doing what he pleases, what he doesn't know is he is fulfilling God's will. Because Alexander's conquests not only spread the Greek Empire, it also spread the Greek language. A language that became known as the Common Greek, the Koine Greek. The Greek that the New Testament is written in, Koine Greek. And so, as the entire known world is now united linguistically, later when Jesus comes and he sends out his apostles to spread his gospel message, guess what? Anywhere they went, they met Greek-speaking people. And as they wrote the Bible in Greek and they gave it to people, it didn't matter if they were people in Babylon or people in Egypt or people in Asia Minor. Guess what? They could all read it because they all spoke Greek. How nice that it worked out that way. It didn't just work out that way. It wasn't just a coincidence. God worked it out that way. And, of course, we also might say that his policy of having this melting pot empire where he's bringing people together and we're all going to be united despite our differences, we're all going to be united into this. Well, guess what? That also made gospel proclamation easier because people could go and transcend cultural barriers and speak to one another because they were all already primed for that by Alexander the Great. God will later use the Roman Empire also to help create the peace that was necessary for the gospel message to go out. But here we see that God's already working. He's laying that groundwork. He's getting things ready for his purposes. Now, of course, Alexander is unaware of all of this. He certainly thought he was an unstoppable force, and he even dared, toward the end of his time, to ask people and demand of people that they begin worshiping him as a god. Because no one can stop him. Is he not a god? You might recall that I said that he even began to publish things and say things like, well, I am actually connected to these great heroes of the faith. Well, of the Greek faith, that is. And so he actually began to say, no, I have these divine attributes. But as verse 4 says here, as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up. And you say, oh, it's a shame. He died so young. He died at 32. And why did he die? From malaria, apparently, complicated by alcoholism, it appears. Oh, it's a shame. He died so young. He died so young because God said, that's enough. That's enough. Let's all beware. Now, sometimes the text uses the passive voice here as a subtle nod to God's authority and power. It doesn't always directly say that. It's a subtle nod to God's authority and his power. And we read here in verse 4 that Alexander's kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. Well, who is doing the breaking up? Who is doing the parceling out? That is God. That is God who's doing that. And God here allows 4 generals in particular to eventually take control. This is, again, as he had predicted back in chapter 8. Who are the 4? Well, I do have them. No, excuse me, I don't have them up here. They are Seleucus to the north in Syria, Mesopotamia, Ptolemy to the south in Egypt. I'll give you these 2 names again in just a moment. But Ptolemy was to the south in Egypt. And then Lysimachus to the east in Thrace and Asia Minor, etc. And then you had Cassander to the west in Macedonia and Greece. Now this is all according to God's sovereign plan. And this chapter will focus on 2 divisions, 2 of these divisions, north to south. In case you're like, okay, I can't remember all those names. Let's make this easier. Alexander's kingdom was broken down into these smaller, weaker kingdoms. And the study here focuses just on 2 of them. Now, before we get into those 2, I want to note one other thing that verse 4 says here. His kingdom was broken up to the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants. None of Alexander's posterity inherited the kingdom. You would think, well, Dad conquered everything, so now I'm the king, right? That would be what his son said. Well, his family was eliminated. As one study notes, Aridius, his brother, was made king in Macedonia. Olympias, Alexander's mother, killed him and poisoned Alexander's 2 sons, Hercules and Alexander. Thus, his family was rooted out by its own hands. You might say, well, why did they do that? Well, because ultimately God desired for that to happen. It would be uprooted. And before his sons could make that claim that, yeah, Dad was a god and now we're gods, well, no, his family was uprooted. Just as Jeremiah 18:7 and 8 reminds us, God is in charge of establishing kingdoms and of uprooting them. Alexander was no deity. That tells us the worldly pomp is perishing. Alexander's story shows the vanity of earthly power. But God still used him for his purposes. God still used him for his purposes. And what we're going to do is see that because of his work, this will set the stage for 2 of these 4 kings to affect God's people. 1 king to the south, Ptolemy, and 1 king to the north, Seleucus. And so we're going to talk about them now as we consider God's hand over north and south. God's hand over north and south. Bigger section here, but we won't spend quite as much time on it. We'll just look at some of the details here. Verses 5 through 9. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. After some years, they will form an alliance, the north and south, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful agreement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he, the king of the north, remain in his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her. And as I noted, there's an alternate reading there, and her son, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity into Egypt. And he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter, the king of the north, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. Okay, so that's probably one of the more confusing parts of this chapter. Well, as we're looking at this section, again, this section goes all the way down through verse 20, and it ends with the history of Antiochus IV. We talked a little bit about Antiochus IV, sometimes called Epiphanes. Well, it just so happens, history is funny about this, it just so happens that Antiochus IV is preceded by Antiochus I, II, and III. And so there are three other Antiochuses to talk about. Now, we won't be able to get through all of that today and talk about the fourth. We won't even get a chance really to talk about the third today. But so we'll just talk about the first two Antiochuses. And you might say, where are they? Who are we talking about? Okay, well, we're going to see how this is broken down. In verse 5, we start with the king of the south. Remember, we're really just focusing on the kingdom to the south of Israel, the kingdom south of Jerusalem, kingdom to the north of Jerusalem. Kingdom to the south, including Egypt and all of that area, is being ruled by Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy the First. Sometimes he's called Soter, which is Greek for Savior. He was known as the Savior. Might not like that because there's one Savior, and you're right about that. But he was remembered as Savior because of what he did for his people. Now, he was a general under Alexander, and he had actually been given authority in this area, in this part of the world, and then Alexander died. Well, what does a general do at that point? Does he just go home? No, there actually is warfare that breaks out, and Ptolemy establishes the Ptolemaic dynasty there. And so when we talk about the kingdom of the south, we're talking about the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Ptolemaic empire. Now, to make it easy, and God made it very easy for us, all of the kings in this empire are known as Ptolemy. Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. That's very easy. So if you say, okay, this is a very weird name, okay, you only have to know this name. And if you know this name, you know the name of the kings, and you know the name of the empire, Ptolemy. And that makes it a lot easier. And yes, in Greek, they do try to pronounce that P. I'm trying my best to pronounce that P at the beginning of the word. They do pronounce it, and so I'm trying to do that as well. But he became strong, and he controlled Egypt, Phoenicia, and more. And so this kingdom lasted, and it lasted all the way until Rome finally conquered it in the year 30. So 30 years before Christ was when the Ptolemaic Empire finally fell to Rome. So this lasted for a while. Now, Ptolemy had his own princes. And one of his princes was another one of Alexander's generals. And his name was Seleucus. Seleucus the first. Now, Seleucus served under Ptolemy, but later he gained a far larger dominion, one that included Babylonia, Media, and Syria. And so this is, even though it's a little bit to the west also of Jerusalem, or the east of Jerusalem, it's mainly to the north, and that's how it's being looked at in the text. Now, Seleucus' kingdom was the largest division of Alexander's empire. And so that's why the text says that his domain will be a great domain indeed. It is the greatest of the fracture points of the Grecian Empire there. Now, originally, Ptolemy and Seleucus were supposed to be allies. Originally, they were supposed to be allies. And Ptolemy would just retain control of Palestine, that area right there around Israel and including Israel. But surprise, Seleucus reneged. And then he decided he wanted to establish independence, and he created his own empire. The empire to the north is known as the Seleucid Empire. Now, the Seleucid Empire, you might say, okay, yeah, Ptolemaic Empire had the Ptolemies. The Seleucid Empire has the Seleucises, and yes, that's true. But they also had the Antiochuses. So you had Seleucus the first and Seleucus the second, but you also had Antiochus the first and second and third and fourth. And so these are the kings of the Seleucid Empire to the north. Now I'm trying to break it down as easily as possible here. And as, speaking of breaking things, this alliance broke between Ptolemy and Seleucus. That set up an ongoing rivalry, which led to the First Syrian War and struggles over the Promised Land. And so that led to the first of many Syrian wars and the conflict. Why do we keep reading about the king of the north and the king of the south coming against each other all the time in this text? It's because of the break between Ptolemy and Seleucus. That started right there. Now, again, these are the two kingdoms that we're talking about, and they are to the north and to the south of Jerusalem. Verse 6 tells us that after some years, these two kingdoms will form an alliance after some years. That would be after about 35 years to be exact. And so we move past Ptolemy the first and Seleucus the first to their progeny. And their progeny decide, you know what, let's stop the fighting and let's form an alliance. That seems sensible. Don't need to continue having the family feud, if you will. We can bury the hatchet and try to form an alliance. And so this alliance would have been with Ptolemy II from about he started reigning about 285. And Antiochus II. You say, wait a minute, what happened to Antiochus I? He's just not important to this prophecy. We're just moving on to Antiochus II. So Antiochus the first, he was an interesting figure. He's just not relevant. He's not germane to this. So these two kingdoms tried to end the conflict between them through an alliance that would be sealed, get this, through a political marriage. A political marriage. And sometimes we talk about political marriage in the metaphorical sense. We are talking about it here in the literal sense. There would be a marriage that takes place for the purpose of politics and diplomacy. So the king of the south, Ptolemy II, had his daughter Berenice marry Antiochus II and sire an heir through her, an heir to the throne for the northern kingdom through her. The goal was political stability and influence. Now, such marriages were not unique. This did happen from time to time. But the problem here was that Antiochus II was already married and he already had an heir. Antiochus II was married to a woman named Laodice, and she had a son, his son. And for the purpose of this political arrangement, he had to not only divorce her, he had to exile her and his son out of the kingdom so that he could marry Berenice, Ptolemy II's daughter, and bear a son through her. Not exactly happily ever after. But things did not go as planned. The text says here that she, and that's referring to Berenice, shall not retain her position of power. And so 2 years into her marriage, or into their marriage, her father, Ptolemy II, died because he was getting older and he died. And perhaps Antiochus II was unhappy with the arrangement that he had. Maybe he was unhappy with her. Maybe he just pragmatically decided that the need for diplomacy had ended with the death of his father-in-law. But whatever the reason, Antiochus left Berenice and began to seek reconciliation with his first wife, Laodice. And so Berenice lost power. Now, this might start to sound a little bit to you like a daytime television soap opera. These are the days of our lives. And that's especially the case with what happened next. Because Laodice sees Antiochus coming, and she hears what he has to say, and then he wants to reconcile with her, and she knows her husband. And so she feared her fickle husband might again prefer Berenice or change his mind later on. So she made some decisions. And she said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that first our son is put in a position of succession again. Second, I'm going to poison him. And she did. And she killed him. She killed Antiochus II. Now, perhaps this was the fury of a woman scorned. Maybe she didn't see him as the man of attachments that he was coming across as, or whatever he was saying. She was done with him. And his betrayal provoked her betrayal, her lethal retaliation, and he lost his power as well as his life. And that's why the text says that he lost his power. Now, Laodice didn't stop there, because as she's coming back home with her son, she wants to make sure that there is not a rival to the throne. The problem is that now there's Berenice and her son over here. So what does she do? She kills them. And she makes sure that her son is put on the throne, and she gets to reign with him as Queen Regent. Now, that's one kind of happily ever after, I guess, or at least that's what she thought it would be. But this definitely shows us the brokenness of our human condition and our need for God. Now, as you might imagine, this had consequences. This had consequences. And in verse 7, we read that one of Berenice's kin, her brother Ptolemy III, found himself stirred up. As you might imagine. Wait, what happened to my sister? Might remember the story of Simeon and Levi in Genesis 34 and how stirred up they were about their sister. Well, guess what? He is stirred up, and he craves vengeance on the Seleucids for her death. The expected result, this would be the expected result of the murder of the wife in a political marriage. And so Laodice may have found some temporary satisfaction in her husband's death and in Berenice's deaths, but she guaranteed for her people and for her son war. Our sins always bring on unintended consequences, some of which are grave to those who are around us. and even for us, because Ptolemy III invaded Syria, and by some accounts, he even executed Laodice. So there we go. Now we've come full circle. And he returned to Egypt with vast booty. He had all kinds of treasures he had taken. And some of those treasures included some of the gods. This was seen as such a slap in the face in the ancient world. When you not only go and invade a place and beat up their army, but you take all their gods from their treasury, that was seen as you saying, okay, I am greater than your gods. And in fact, this also may have been some of their own gods that had been stolen a while ago. But for whatever the reason, they took them, they brought them back. And this actually ensured some prosperity for Egypt for a time. And because of some domestic issues, Ptolemy III said, okay, I took care of business. I need to now take care of business at home. And what does the text say? He refrains from attacking the king of the north for some years. For about 10 years, he just focuses on Egypt. And he just ignores the Seleucid Empire. And that was the Third Syrian War. Now, I should say in verse 9, we see just one little final flare-up that happened. And that's because Seleucus II was upset, perhaps with his mother's death, perhaps just with the attack or some combination thereof. And he decides we need to retaliate. And he launches an attack into Egypt, except he doesn't even make it to Egypt. And he is turned back and he has to retreat. And that is the end of the Third Great Syrian War. That also marks the height of the Ptolemaic power. And when I say the height, I mean things will go downhill after this. But the South now retains control of the beautiful land, but not for long. We'll talk about that next time. There's one other historical point that's worth noting, though, before we close here. The Ptolemies had taken Jews captive in the past and placed them into Alexandria. The famous Alexandria, where they had the library. Well, there's a large Jewish community there because they had been captured and taken there. And under Ptolemy III, they had completed a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, which is known as the Septuagint. That's when the Septuagint happens. It's during the reign of Ptolemy III. And guess what the Septuagint includes? It includes the book of Daniel. What we're reading about here, being prophesied, is being not only read, but also translated under the reign of Ptolemy III, which means that Daniel existed a lot earlier than what the critics claim it existed, because all of this was being translated into Greek at that point in history. Now that tells us something. That tells us, as we wrap this up, that this is proof of divine inspiration, because this has been confirmed. It has been confirmed to precede these events. It is not some writer writing some kind of weird fan fiction, historical fiction of a prophecy that takes place that perfectly predicts history in the future, but it's really just a man looking at history and writing it as prophecy from the future. Rather, it is, in fact, prophecy that is perfectly predicting what will take place. And critical scholars will want to think that some of this prophecy is late in its date, as I said, but they operate with assumptions that prophecy just can't exist. The facts, though, the facts support that the book of Daniel was penned, not even at the time of its translation, but before that. And really, as we look at the evidence, we can pin it down with a pinning of the 6th century. The 6th century. This is Daniel at the end of the Babylonian captivity, seeing prophecy that's future for him. And we've just scratched the surface to this wondrous prophecy. Now remember that this text would have been a comfort for God's people. Though they would have had warfare, they could know that God predicted it ahead of time and that they could survive and that they could trust in him. Now, sadly, not everyone would. Not everyone would. And it would not go well for them. We'll talk about that next time, Lord willing. But it is vital for us today to trust in what God says. It is vital for us to trust in the history that he has promised control of. And whatever we do in this life, may it always be to God's glory, trusting his word and allowing him to fulfill everything that he has promised.